Hello and welcome to today's webinar by ScriptRunner. Today's session will be all about using PowerShell scripts with more security. I am Aline Imhof of the ScriptRunner team, and we are very happy that you tuned in today. If you have any questions during the webinar, we invite you to use the GoToWebinar feature in the panel on the right. At the end of the session, we will try to hold a small Q&A. If we don't get to answer your question, we will contact you personally by mail. We will also ask questions during the webinar, which I will be starting right now. And now you can see the question. And it is, how often do you visit IT fairs and events? Never, every few days, once per year, 2 to 3 times a year or more often. While you take your time to answer, I want to introduce today's speaker. Heiko Brenn is Head of International Business here at ScriptRunner, and he will demonstrate a few safety tips and tricks today. Hi, Heiko.
Hi, Aline. Hello, everybody. Looking forward to tell you a few things about security and PowerShell.
Yeah, we are all looking forward to it. And now I want to talk a little bit about the results of our first poll. We can see that most of you are visiting several events per year, and the others are just going once a year. Thanks for the participation. So now we can get right into it, and I'll give to you, Heiko.
All right, thanks, Aline. Okay, so our today's topic is all around security and PowerShell. And we already heard a little bit about logistics. Just one comment from my side. So the slides that you will see and also the webinar recording you will receive afterwards after the webinar session. So the agenda for this webinar consists of 2 topics. One is I want to look at the different aspects of security and PowerShell. And in the second part, we will look at how ScriptRunner actually enhances this built-in PowerShell security functionality and how you can make use of that. Starting with the first part, PowerShell security is actually a real wide area. So I will dig into a few of these topics here, but based on the time that we have, it will really just be a general overview about these different security aspects. And I want to start with the part of execution policy. So if you're familiar with PowerShell, you most probably know that you can set different execution policies for and how to execute PowerShell scripts. But important to know here is that this is actually not really a security protection feature, because what it does, it just simply makes sure that somebody is not accidentally executing some scripts that they should not be allowed. And in order to do that, you can use the set execution policy commandlet to set different levels, which could be restricted or all signed, which means all the scripts that you want to run have to be digitally signed or remote signed, for example, unregistered, and so on. So there are different levels of execution policies. But again, keep in mind that this is really not a security feature in the real sense, because it protects or makes sure that you don't accidentally execute code. On the other hand, there are many ways around that, and I will show you a few examples in a second. And so it is better than nothing, I would say, but if you're going to use it, it really makes sense to roll that feature out via the group policy, because by doing that, you make sure that what you want to set as a default is really being used, and it cannot be overwritten by local settings, because it's the other way around. If you set a GPO, then this is, and somebody tries to change it on a local machine, it will not work, it will not be effective. So I want to show you that in a little demo. So I'm going to switch to my VMware, well, my VM, and then we will take a look at the possibilities that we have here. So I'll show you the right screen. All right, so here we are on a Windows 10 machine, and yeah, as I said, you can just take a look at the execution policy, and if you look in here, it's at the moment it is set, it's all signed. That means only scripts that are digitally signed I will able to run, and if I'm running a script that is not digitally signed, it will fail to execute. And if I'm taking a look at the policy again with the list parameter, we see here that there are different levels where execution policies can be configured, and this all signed comes from the machine policy. So there is a global policy in the backend that has been distributed to this machine, and even though on the local machine somebody tried to set the execution policy and bypass, which means there will be no restriction at all, is not taking into effect because the machine policy, the GPO functionality, is the one that really matters in this scenario. And to be able to set that, yeah, if you take a look at the GPO setting here under the computer configuration, there is one part about Windows PowerShell, and here you can actually configure the execution policy. So only allow signed scripts is equals to all signed. Allows local scripts and remote script only signed. This is the remote signed, and so on. So you can set that here. You can distribute this to the machines, and then it's configured. But what it actually means is that, for example, if you set the policy to remote signed, for example, and you're downloading a file from the internet, which we can do right here, which is a PowerShell script that actually would download all session videos and presentations from the Ignite of 2017. And if I'm saving that and I would try to execute that, then I should get some information here that said it's not digitally signed. That is the one thing, but it's also coming from the outside, so it's a remote file. And in order to change that, so to make sure to make it possible for PowerShell to just also execute a PowerShell script, even though it came from remote, but is very simple, because you can just here use the unplug feature, and then by doing that, you're kind of pretending that this is a local file, and then immediately a remote sign policy is just not working anymore for this script. So this is just one simple example that shows that really this execution policy, yes, you can do it, and it will prevent some things from happening, but it's not really a security feature in the real sense. So, and that brings us to a next example here. The digital signature functionality that I just mentioned, because if you say execution policy is on all signed, then only scripts that are digitally signed will be executed. The one that we just saw was not, so it got prohibited from running. And what digital signatures do is answering two questions: is who has actually created the PowerShell script that you're trying to run? So it's about authentication, and it answers the question: has the script been changed after the signing process? So during the creation of that PowerShell script and sending to you, or copy it somewhere else. So you can use that functionality. You can create your own signature files with, for example, the new self-signed certificate commandlet. You can, of course, to make it even more secure, you can use official certificates that have been that come from official authorities. Then, of course, it has an additional level of security, and then you can use that script if it has the code signing property. Then you can use that to sign a script, and then it's secured in a way that, okay, if only signed scripts are allowed to run, then this happens with this signed scripts. You also have to, but you have to keep in mind that, of course, if you make changes to a script, though every time you change the script, you have to re-sign that, because then otherwise the signature gets broken, so to speak. And PowerShell is also able to detect if somebody tries to sneak in some kind of code, some kind of commandlets into a signature block. And so that is something that definitely helps to make the things more secure when it comes to PowerShell, and to get some more information about actually what is going on, who is running which scripts. There are different logging mechanisms that you, again, kind of the same like the execution policy, that you can set manually local on each and every machine. So there is the module logging, there is the script block logging that really gives a lot of information about the details, about things that are executed. All this information ends up in the PowerShell log part of the Windows Event Viewer, and this really makes sense. Just also to if you have some issues, to see what happened. Of course, you cannot prevent things from happening, but you can look into the history and see what actually happened when the PowerShell script got executed. And of course, there is the strand script that captures all the commands that you type in. And again, this is something that if you're going to use it, it should be definitely being rolled out via the GPO, because by that you make sure that it's running everywhere, and that makes sure that nobody is trying to deactivate it, for example. Another area of security relates to the constraint language. What does that mean? That means that you can configure what parts of the language, meaning what commandlets, what parameters are allowed by which users. So in general, if you start a PowerShell session and you have no policies in place, then you're running in full language mode, and then you can switch that, for example, to constraint language, and then only particular or some parts of modules and external functions, stuff like that, are not available. But if you close the session and you start a new one, then by default, you are again in the full language mode. So that's why it also only makes sense if you have combined to that functionality, if you have a centralized security function in place, for example, like app locker, where you configure this policy centrally and then you distribute it to all your machines. And so this is a way that then you have more security when it comes to running scripts on clients or on servers. The constraint language functionality itself really is if you don't do it centrally, it's just valid for the session that you're using right now. So to make that really a security feature that works more or less all the time, then you should combine that with AppLogger, for example. Another area of security, of course, which is quite important, is everything around credentials. And actually, it's one of the biggest challenges when it comes to running PowerShell scripts, because in general, if you're logging into a local machine or into Active Directory, or you're using remote PowerShell, then of course you have to kind of get some credentials, some user and password to log into these machines and get the session. And so in some way or another, a username and password are typically required. And of course, on the other hand, having users and passwords in the script itself is of course absolutely no-go. So there are possibilities to, especially when it comes to the interactive usage of PowerShell, where you can make sure that the passwords are not being stored in clear text, that you put it into encrypted password file, for example, which is something that you can do. But also for this, you have to keep in mind that if you have an encrypted password in a file, that works perfectly on the same machine. But if you're copying the script together with this password file on a different machine, it will not work. So this brings up the question, how can that be used if you have multiple people should be able to run scripts if you have scenarios where passwords have to be changed regularly? How can that work, especially in the context of delegating things, and to make not just if it's not just you running a PowerShell script, but you want to give this to a group of people, and then you're pretty quickly end up in a situation where all these functionalities are not really working when it comes to again, it's not just you, but people in the team, maybe people in the help desk area, or if you want to even go to the level of delegating things to end users. And another technology that was introduced by Microsoft is GA, just enough administration, and that is actually a technology and a way to make sure that the user that is starting a script doesn't have to have all the permissions, for example, to do everything on Exchange, if it's just about creating a mailbox or maybe changing mailbox quotas or something like this. So it's all about limiting the privileges. And this was introduced a while ago, so it's available since PowerShell 5.0. It is available by default with Windows Server 2016 and Windows 10, and it's a role-based access control, and it's about creating endpoints where you configure what can be executed. So we're talking about whitelisting, so which commandlets, which commands, which parameters should be available. And then you have to combine that with what's called the session configuration. So who is allowed to connect to that endpoint, and then in the next step is which tasks this are allowed. And so this is a way where you can try to actually also delegate tasks to people in help desk, but you have to make sure, or you have to keep in mind that whatever you do with GA, and it can become pretty complex actually, not just the implementation, but also the day-to-day maintaining. If you think about the whitelisting, for example, so if the new scripts are coming up and you want to be able to make them available, you have to maintain this whitelisting constantly. And of course, also we're still talking about that the actual PowerShell script is triggered, is executed by somebody who has to be able to start the PowerShell console, native or ISE or Visual Code or whatever. And so you still are in a situation where people have to be familiar with PowerShell. And so this is something that for many companies we see is an issue, because, well, there are not everybody is a PowerShell expert. So if it comes to a situation where you want to bring that power of PowerShell to more than just the PowerShell experts, then you pretty soon end up in a situation where you have some limitations. And this is exactly the starting point for Script Runner, where Script Runner comes into the picture, because what Script Runner is doing on top of the PowerShell engine is something, or there are different areas actually. And so if you look at PowerShell, which is a powerful engine, and then questions come up, and wouldn't it be a good thing if you would be able to get all these PowerShell scripts that you want to use, that you want to run, and you want to develop in a team, if they could be stored in a central place, so you have one central repository, you allow and you configure the access to that scripts would it be for developing scripts in a team, or to actually use and execute these scripts? So the permissions and the access is maintained within Script Runner. For the development part, we have a plugin for the ISE. At the moment, there will be one for Visual Studio Code. In the near future, you can integrate that all with TFS, GitHub, and other systems. And we have the Script Runner action packs, which are available on GitHub, where you can very simply get a big set of ready-to-use PowerShell scripts that you can also integrate into that single source of truth, into this centralized repository. And this, at the end, is the basis for a real secure and centralized execution and delegation, and at the end, also monitoring and getting some dashboard and overall auditing about who has executed which script with which results, for example. As a second step, if we look at security, of course, we mentioned that in the beginning, it's all about the credential management, which means wouldn't it be great if you have a central place to store credentials and you don't have to care on the user side who is actually be able to access that credentials or to type in that credentials, and that is also something that can be done with Script Runner, because we are having a centralized place where we put all the necessary credentials to run scripts, and which also means there is no credential information in any PowerShell script. And these credentials are then being used to connect to different targets, as we call them. And a target could be Active Directory, it's Exchange, it's a Hyper-V, SharePoint, Office 365, Azure, or whatever. And this information, so these credentials, they are either being stored on the local Windows Credential Store on the Script Runner server, which is a Windows server. And as a second possibility, you are able to use password servers, and password servers from CyberArk, from Thycotic, and from Pleasant. And in this scenario, the necessary credentials are stored in a central repository. So even if you have multiple instances of Script Runner asking for credentials, they all go to a central place. You don't have to maintain these credentials on different machines. And so this is one of the reasons why it makes sense to actually work with password servers, because you have a centralized management and you can use it with multiple instances of your PowerShell infrastructure. And I think, Aline, we have an additional question regarding the...
Thank you. It's the question about password servers and which kind you already use, or do you not use a password server at all? Would be great if you could just give your vote for one of the products we have connectors with as well. But if you have others in mind, let us know and we can see what we can do. Thank you. Thanks for the answers. I'll just show the results again, and we see that half of you don't use a password server at the moment. Maybe you are planning to. And then we have CyberArk and Thycotic users. Thanks for the answers. And back to you, Heiko.
Okay, great. Yeah, so and as I mentioned, even if you don't use password servers, and that's what our customers are always starting with, of course, is are using the local credential store. And actually, their passwords are stored in the context of the local system. So it's not even a user, so which makes it even more difficult to get that information. And so which brings in another level of security. In the third step, then it's all about privileges and permissions, as we just also, as I mentioned early on. So what you want to avoid, of course, is granting privileges, permissions to users just to be able to fulfill one single task. So you don't want to make people full Exchange admin or full SharePoint admin or SQL Server admin and so on. So what the Script Runner here brings into the picture is that all the scripts that we have in a central place, where we have the credentials and the targets, these scripts are executed in the context of the script runner backend. And so that means we can connect and we can execute scripts in the backend with service accounts. So this is the typical scenario where you don't use user accounts, you have specific service accounts, just like you know from backup software and stuff like that. And that makes it very easy to execute that scripts. And on the other hand, it avoids that you have to give permissions to the users in help desk or even within the admin team, because this, let's say, the script on the machine is the execution proxy to run the scripts that you want to run in the backend. And so that brings us to the fourth column here, which means we run all this functionality in a secure environment on the server. And of course, if we talk about infrastructure, you can have proxies, firewalls in place as well from this perspective. And there are different execution levels. Of course, as you know from PowerShell, we can do local execution, PowerShell remoting, implicit remoting. You can use session configuration that you use for the GA functionality, and we have many more options. And the execution itself is threefold. So they can be executed manually by the admin, by the help desk, or even by end users by using our web interface. So it's a browser-based application here, and everything that is being done there is logged centrally. We have a centralized dashboard. We have perfmon counters that you can use if you want to look at the performance. So everything is under a central control, and that in the last step gives us the possibility to actually delegate PowerShell execution in a safe way to users that are definitely no PowerShell experts. They don't have to know anything about PowerShell. They don't need to be able to run a PowerShell console, and they don't need the privileges to run things in the backend, for example, on the Active Directory or in Exchange, because that's being controlled by the script runner. And to show you that, I will switch to my VM, so you get an idea about how that actually looks like, the thing that I just talked about. So just a second. All right, so here we on my VM. And starting with the first step, which is developing scripts from a central place. This is where this add-in comes into play, which we see here on the right side, which presents me the available scripts, and I have scripts that I can edit and others I can just only view. And important to know that what we see here, the information, and if I'm downloading that now, it's not a file access. It's all controlled via the script runner service in the backend. And that, of course, gives it an additional layer of security. So, and you can make a check-in, check-out functionality. And you can, of course, configure who should be able to see which script, which brings me to the next step, which is looking at the admin app from Script Runner. And because here you can, for example, delegate which scripts should be available via this plugin and to which group of people. So this is step one here. The step two is then, as we said before or earlier, it's about having centralized credentials, which we see here. For example, you can configure different credentials, for example, to fulfill Exchange tasks or Hyper-V tasks or Azure or other systems like SharePoint. So you configure all that necessary credentials here in a central place. You can combine that with the target. So a target is something like an Active Directory or an Exchange or Office 365. And that actually the target then uses this credential that we have configured here, and all the necessary information is then being used during runtime to access, for example, an Exchange environment. And all that ends up in what we call actions. And in these actions, this represents the whole set of functionality. So, for example, you want to have you have a PowerShell script to enable or disable out of office settings. And so this is the web interface. Now we're looking at the admin side of things, where I'm going to switch to the end user in just a second. So you're selecting whatever you are able to see. So this could be just a particular OU. In this case, we have a particular predefined text. We have a calendar control for the absence period, and I'm running that in the backend. And of course, when I want to delegate that, I can do this as well. And I'm choosing just the groups of people that I want to delegate this task to. And what that means is that the people who have the right to access and to start that action, they will see a particular tile in the delegate app. And they start just this process by clicking on the tile, which looks like this here. So here is a user that is working with Delegate app, and it's just 2 tasks that have been delegated to this person. And it just clicks on that tile, and we see, okay, what this user is actually able to select. And if there are things that you say, okay, I can pre-populate that information and it shouldn't be visible, and you can just hide that, which makes then this interface here even simpler and easier to use for the end user. And then in the backend, the script runner takes care that we do that, we run that task in the right context, and the user itself is still stays a normal domain user, and everything that is necessary to run that script is handled by the script runner in the backend. And if you want to see what has been done with from which user, you have the dashboard where you can drill down to the actions, for example, and to say, okay, I want to see who has actually recently started and worked with that out of office settings. And I can go here and I see that here the user Theo, this is the one that I just used, was starting this out of office PowerShell script in the backend without actually knowing it, because it's just a tile, right? And going and using the target exchange with the credential here that is combined with the target. The user itself here doesn't know anything about what's going on in the backend, and they of course don't have any permissions to do it, because the execution proxy, which is the script runner, makes sure that everything runs in the right way, and the end user itself is just clicking on the tile and starting this action. And of course, that can be used for many different tasks. I mentioned these action packs that you can find on GitHub, where you see many examples for Exchange, for Active Directory, for Hyper-V, for SharePoint, Office 365, and things like that. And you can just simply use that to run and to start delegating and automating things with PowerShell, and especially things that you maybe right now are not really able to, based on the fact that of course you don't want to give permissions to users. You don't want to make these users all the user to PowerShell experts. So if you look at the solution, it's really what we are adding to the PowerShell engine is a secure PowerShell lifecycle that supports you from the development part to the running of scripts, delegation of scripts, and having a centralized control and dashboard about all the activities. And yeah, you could say it's about kind of democratizing PowerShell from not just having the PowerShell expert people running with it, but using the possibilities of PowerShell to use it in the whole entire infrastructure in the entire company, and to make it give you a small picture for how that actually works on a very high level. So at the back end, we have all the different components like Active Directory, Exchange, SharePoint, Office 365, print servers, whatever. Then you have the PowerShell engine, and on top of that, Script Runner makes sure that for all the different roles in the company, for the developer, the admins, DevOps, help desk, and end user, we are preparing and providing the right functionality to make more use of PowerShell as you might probably do today. And that's the basic idea when it comes to using Script Runner on top of PowerShell. All right, so that's it for my part. Aline, are there any questions came in?
No, not yet. So this is the point where you can ask us some questions. And in the meantime, I will finish up with the last poll of today. We want to get to know your PowerShell infrastructure, and that's why we are asking how many people have access to your PowerShell scripts. Of course, that's a big security question. The more people have access, the more challenges you get. And you have to think about a lot of things when you give other people access to your scripts. Thank you. And we can stop that poll again and show the results. We can see that it's evenly divided, but the majority is using scripts in a team, which is more than one person. So again, that's already a security challenge, and more people mean more challenges. Thank you.
Exactly. So this is where again Script Runner comes into the picture, where we can make sure that all this, we really make a real solution out of PowerShell. And because if you look at the core of PowerShell, it is kind of still kind of a single user solution. And if you want to start using that in teams, even outside your teams, if you're thinking about help desk and end user self-services, it's definitely worth looking into that solution because of the security that we can offer, but also because of all this management functionality that we offer all around using PowerShell. And if you want to know more about it, there are different ways. You can look at our website. You can test our software. You look at other webinars, or as Aline mentioned at the beginning, if you're traveling maybe next week and you come to Amsterdam to the Ignite, the tour, we are there. Would be happy to meet you there and talk PowerShell with you.
Thank you, Heiko, for the invitation and the helpful insights of today. If you have any questions left, just feel free to get in touch with us. You can contact us through our website, through mail, or social networks. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll hopefully see you next time.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.